The Texas sun burned like hot coals over the Whitmore plantation in June of 1863. The heavy air carried the smell of ripe cotton mixed with the sweat of worn-out bodies working under a merciless sky. Among the endless rows of white cotton bushes, one woman stood apart, not because of her height or strength, but because of her eyes. Her gaze held quiet storms, memories burned into her soul with iron and fire. Before we move forward with Evelyn's powerful story of resistance and justice, if you are enjoying this content, please press the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more untold stories of courage and survival into the light. Now, let us go deeper into Evelyn's world. Evelyn was 32 years old, yet she seemed to carry the burden of many lifetimes. Her hardened fingers knew every strand of cotton, every sharp thorn that tore flesh, every drop of blood spilled on that cursed ground. She was born into slavery on a small plantation in Louisiana, sold at the age of 12 when her first owner fell into debt, and sold again at 19 to the Whitmore plantation in eastern Texas. For 14 long years she had endured life under the Whitmore family's rule. 14 years of crushing labor, constant humiliation, and a special kind of cruelty that did not come from the master himself, but from his wife. Margaret Whitmore was a woman full of strange contradictions to the outside world, to nearby plantation families and visitors from Austin or Houston. To them, she appeared to be the picture of Southern grace and Christian virtue. She wore fine dresses brought from New Orleans, hosted tea gatherings where she talked about books and fashion, and gave generous donations to the local church. Her smile was carefully practiced, her manners perfect, her voice always calm and sweet like honeyed tea. But behind the closed doors of the Whitmore estate, Margaret showed her true nature. She carried a deep cruelty that ran stronger than the roots of the ancient oak trees spread across the land. While her husband Charles handled the business side of the plantation with cold distance, it was Margaret who ruled the house slaves with an iron hand hidden beneath polite behavior. She took special interest in punishment, especially when it involved women. Evelyn learned this painful truth within her first month on the plantation. A small mistake, a teacup placed at the wrong angle on its saucer, earned her 10 lashes from the overseer. Margaret watched calmly from the shade of the big house veranda, sipping lemonade and making remarks about how the punishment was carried out. That was the first time Evelyn saw the whipping tree. It was a massive live oak standing about 50 yards from the main house, its thick branches spreading wide like arms of judgment over bare ground smoothed by countless footsteps. That tree became a symbol of fear for every enslaved person on the Whitmore land. Its bark was scarred by ropes that once bound wrists. Its roots had soaked in blood, and its shade offered no comfort, only the promise of pain. Margaret had chosen this tree herself because it was easy to see from the fields. She wanted every slave to witness what happened to those who displeased her. She wanted screams to travel on the wind as a constant reminder of her power. Over the years, Evelyn was taken to that tree more times than she could remember. 5 lashes for serving dinner 3 minutes late, 15 for a wrinkle in a freshly pressed tablecloth, 20 for daring to meet Margaret's eyes for a moment too long. Each punishment was delivered by the overseer, a brutal man named Jeremiah Cobb, who took clear pleasure in his work, always under Margaret's close supervision. She stood near enough to see every welt rise on broken skin, near enough to hear every cry of pain, her face calm, as if she were watching a pleasant garden gathering. Yet what Evelyn suffered was small compared to the fate of other women who drew Margaret's attention. There was Sarah, barely 20 years old, whose only crime was her beauty. Margaret, fearful of her own fading youth and suspicious that her husband might notice the young woman, ordered Sarah whipped so badly that her back became covered in permanent scars. Sarah was then sold to a plantation in Mississippi, torn away from her mother and younger siblings, sent off as a warning to anyone else who might attract unwanted notice. There was also Prudence, an older woman who served as a midwife among the slave quarters. When Prudence tried to save a young mother and her baby during a difficult birth, Margaret refused to allow rest because field quotas still had to be met. Both mother and child died. Margaret blamed Prudence for the loss of valuable property and ordered 30 lashes, even though the woman was nearly 60. Prudence survived but never truly recovered, her spirit broken along with her body. These stories, and many more, lived inside Evelyn's memory like restless ghosts. She saw Margaret's cruelty not only aimed at herself, but poured over an entire community with no protection, no justice, no hope in a system designed to strip them of their humanity. Every scream from the whipping tree, every wounded body limping back to the quarters, every family torn apart by Margaret's bitter choices. All of it gathered inside Evelyn like dry wood waiting for a spark. What made Margaret's cruelty even harder to bear was how she justified it. She quoted scripture while ordering punishment, claiming she was saving souls through discipline, that slavery was ordained by God, and that her harsh actions were a form of Christian charity meant to civilize lesser beings. She attended church every Sunday, sang hymns with her clear voice, and returned home to order another slave whipped for some small offense, seeing no contradiction in her behavior. Charles Whitmore, Margaret's husband, was cruel in a different way. He was not openly violent like his wife. He rarely involved himself in daily discipline or punishment. His cruelty was distant and calculated. He viewed the enslaved people on his land as numbers in a ledger, property meant to produce profit. He set impossible work demands, broke families apart when it made financial sense, and sold children away from their mothers without hesitation if the price was right. His distance from violence did not make him innocent. It only allowed him to keep his hands clean while others carried out his will. In 1863, the Whitmore plantation existed in a strange state of tension. The Civil War had been raging for 2 years, and news of battles and losses reached eastern Texas through rumors and fragments. Enslaved people whispered about freedom, about a man named Lincoln who had issued a proclamation, about Union armies moving through the South. But Texas felt far from the fighting. Protected by distance and stubborn Confederate belief, the Whitmores clung to their way of life, convinced their world of cotton, slavery, and racial order would last foe. Rever. Evelyn listened closely to every scrap of news. She learned to read in secret, taught by an elderly man named Moses, who had somehow gained literacy before being sold to Texas. This was a dangerous act of rebellion. Slaves caught reading could be badly punished or killed, and teachers faced severe punishment. But Moses believed knowledge was a kind of freedom that could never be taken away, and he shared it only with those he trusted. Evelyn learned quickly. Within 2 years, she could read newspapers that occasionally reached the plantation, uncovering truth hidden beneath Confederate lies. She learned about Nat Turner's rebellion, about Harriet Tubman leading people to freedom, about Denmark Vesey's planned uprising. She learned that resistance was possible and that enslaved people had always fought back in large and small ways. These stories taught her that chains could bind her body, but never her mind or her spirit. In the spring of 1863, something inside Evelyn changed. Maybe it was the weight of years of abuse. Maybe it was the sense that the world itself was shifting. Or maybe it was one final act of cruelty. One humid April evening, Margaret, in a particularly bitter mood, accused Evelyn of stealing a valuable brooch that once belonged to her grandmother. Evelyn had been working in the kitchen all day with witnesses, but the truth did not matter. Margaret needed someone to punish, and Evelyn was her chosen target. She had begun to suspect that Evelyn was too intelligent, too defiant, and that her spirit needed to be broken. The punishment was set for the next morning at the whipping tree. 25 lashes, severe enough to leave lasting scars and frighten the others. That night, lying in the cramped quarters she shared with 6 other women, something became clear in Evelyn's mind. She knew she had reached the end of endurance. She could continue to survive through silence and submission, hoping freedom might arrive before she was destroyed. Or she could act, knowing action might mean death, but believing death might be better than endless humiliation. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the sky hanging low, as if the world itself was holding its breath, threatening rain but holding it back, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Evelyn was led from the quarters by Jeremiah Cobb, the overseer, his face already marked by a grim eagerness for the violence he knew was coming. Other slaves were dragged away from their work so they could witness the punishment. As was Margaret's habit, she believed deeply in the teaching power of public suffering. They formed a hesitant semicircle around the whipping tree, their faces carefully empty, trained by years of survival to show no sign of feeling that could be mistaken for pity or defiance. Margaret arrived wearing a pale blue dress that felt almost offensive in its lightness given the moment. She held a parasol to shield her skin from the sun, which was now pushing through the thinning clouds. She placed herself about 10 feet from the tree, close enough to see every detail, but far enough to keep any blood from staining her fine clothes. She gave Cobb a small nod, granting permission for the punishment to start. Evelyn was brought forward, her wrists tied with coarse rope, and fastened to a low branch that forced her to rise onto her toes. Her back was exposed, open to the eyes of her fellow slaves and to the whip that Cobb was already testing with sharp swings through the air. The sound of leather slicing the damp morning air was harsh and frightening, a clear promise of pain about to fall. But just as Cobb pulled his arm back for the first strike, something unexpected happened. Evelyn turned her head as far as the ropes would allow and looked straight at Margaret. Not with lowered eyes like a submissive slave, not with the empty stare of someone trying only to endure, but with a look so intense, so alive with awareness and accusation, that Margaret actually stepped back. In that moment, Evelyn spoke. Her voice was steady and strong, carrying clearly across the gathered slaves to Margaret's ears. She spoke only 4 words, but those 4 words shifted everything. God sees your sin. The silence that followed was complete and heavy. Even the birds seemed to fall quiet, as if the world itself understood the weight of what had just been said. Margaret's face changed again and again. First shock, then rage, then something harder to name, perhaps fear, or the stirring of a conscience she had buried long ago under layers of comfort and excuse. Jeremiah Cobb stood frozen, whip raised, unsure of what to do next. He glanced at Margaret for direction, but the plantation mistress appeared briefly trapped, her parasol shaking slightly in her hand. The slaves held their blank expressions, but something charged passed through them. A shared awareness that a boundary had been crossed, that an unspoken rule governing their lives had just been broken in the most direct way. Margaret forced herself back into control, her face stiffening into anger. 2 lashes, she said tightly. Then, almost instantly, no. Make it 40. This slave needs to learn that silence is a virtue, and that speaking the word of God from such a mouth is the worst blasphemy. Cobb nodded and brought the whip down with practiced cruelty. The leather struck Evelyn's back with a sound like a gunshot, tearing a burning line across her skin. She gasped but did not cry out. The second lash fell, then the third, each one carving deeper pain. As the punishment continued, blood began to seep and soak into the waistband of her rough cotton dress. Still, Evelyn did not beg. She did not apologize. She endured, her body taking the blows while her mind slipped somewhere beyond the reach of the whip. By the 20th lash, Cobb was sweating hard. By the 30th, some of the watching slaves had tears running down their faces, though none dared make a sound. By the 40th, Evelyn's back was torn and bleeding, and she finally slipped into unconsciousness, her body hanging loose from the ropes at the tree. Margaret watched every strike with an expression that was difficult to read. There was satisfaction there, the cold pleasure of unchecked power, but there was also something else, something close to unease. Evelyn's words had lodged in her mind like sharp splinters she could not remove. God sees your sin, the phrase echoed, clashing with what she was witnessing and refusing to be ignored. When it was over, Cobb cut Evelyn down, and 2 of the women carried her limp body back to the quarters. Margaret ordered the slaves back to work, then returned to the big house, where she claimed a headache and shut herself away. She tried to read and write letters, but her focus kept drifting. The day felt wrong, as if something unseen had shifted out of place. In the quarters, the women tended to Evelyn with the quiet skill born of too much experience. They washed her ruined back with water and the little salt they had to fight infection, laid herbal mixtures Moses had taught them to gather from the woods, and wrapped her in clean cloth. Evelyn drifted in and out of awareness for 3 days, her body battling fever while her mind wandered through memory and dream. In those fevered days, Evelyn moved backward through her life. She remembered her mother, Ruth, sold away when Evelyn was only 7. She heard again her mother's last words. Remember who you are. They can take everything else, but they cannot take who you are unless you let them. She remembered Stan. Ding on an auction block in New Orleans, white men inspecting her like an animal. She remembered each plantation she had been sent to, each one its own kind of hell, but she also remembered moments of beauty and quiet resistance. Songs sung at night, filled with hidden messages of freedom. Secret gatherings in the woods to worship, to share news, to marry and celebrate children without white control. She remembered learning to read, how letters turned from strange marks into doors of power. Most of all, something settled firmly inside her during those dreams. The whipping had not destroyed her, it had sharpened her. When the fever finally broke, she felt a calm certainty she had never known before. She understood, in a way deeper than thought, that she would not die quietly as a slave. She would either die resisting, or she would live to see freedom, but she would never again accept Margaret Whitmore's cruelty without pushing back. On the fourth day, Evelyn was able to sit up and sip broth. Moses came to see her, his old face marked with worry and a deeper recognition. He sat close and spoke in the low tone reserved for dangerous truths. "You know what you did," he said. "You broke the spell of fear. Everyone heard you speak to Miss Margaret, and they heard the strength in your voice. That's dangerous, child. Dangerous and precious." Evelyn nodded, pain still burning with every movement. "I know," she said. "I can't go back to how things were. I won't." Moses studied her carefully. "There's talk," he said. "The war isn't going the way the Confederacy claims. The Union is moving south. Texas is far, but change is coming. The question is whether we wait for it or help it along." Evelyn felt her heart race. "What are you saying?" she asked, though she already sensed the answer. Moses leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Folks are tired of waiting. There are meetings in the woods, forming. Not certain yet, but real. Plans to run. Not just one or two, but dozens, moving together, guided by people who know the paths toward Union lines. It's dangerous, maybe worse than staying, but some believe it's worth the risk." "When?" Evelyn asked. "Not yet," Moses replied. "Weeks, maybe months. We're watching, waiting for the right moment, but when it comes, you should have the choice." Evelyn nodded, her mind already moving forward, the idea of running toward freedom lighting a fire inside her chest. Margaret Whitmore, the whipping tree, and all the gathered cruelty and injustice she had seen and suffered weighed heavily on her mind. A part of her, a part that frightened her because of how strong it felt, wanted more than just escape. It wanted justice. It wanted the balance of power to change, even if only briefly, even if only in a small and quiet way. Over the next several weeks, as Evelyn's back slowly healed, leaving behind a web of raised scars that would stay with her for the rest of her life, she returned to her duties inside the big house. Margaret treated her with a fresh coldness, adding more work to her days and watching closely for any sign of defiance. But Evelyn had learned how to shape her face into perfect obedience, even while her thoughts moved in very different directions. She began to study the plantation's daily patterns with sharper focus. She noticed when Cobb rode out to inspect the land, when Charles Whitmore traveled to nearby plantations or into town for business, and when Margaret was most often alone in the house. She memorized where keys were kept, the routines of the other house slaves, and the steady habits that ruled life on the Whitmore estate. She did all this without a clear plan, collecting details the way a squirrel stores food for winter, understanding that knowledge itself carried power. In late May, something happened. That changed everything. Charles Whitmore received news that his brother had been killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia. He would have to travel to manage family matters and settle his brother's estate, a trip that would keep him away from the plantation for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. Margaret would remain behind, in charge, with only Cobb and the house slaves for protection and company. The night before Charles left, Evelyn overheard a heated argument between husband and wife. She was meant to be in the kitchen preparing their meal, but their raised voices carried easily through the thin walls of the house. Charles worried about leaving Margaret alone with only an overseer for security, and suggested she stay with relatives in Houston until he returned. Margaret rejected the idea completely. She insisted she was fully capable of running the plantation on her own, and would not abandon her home out of fear or inconvenience. "The slaves are broken," she said with complete confidence. "That whipping I gave Evelyn in April set the proper tone. There hasn't been a whisper of trouble since then. You worry too much, Charles. Go and do what you must. Everything will be just as you left it when you come back." Charles left the next morning, and the plantation fell into a new routine under Margaret's sole command. If anything, she grew harsher, quicker to criticize and faster to punish. It was as if she needed to prove herself, to show that a woman could rule a plantation just as firmly as any man. She pushed the field slaves harder, lengthened their working hours, and cut their already small rations for the smallest offenses. While Margaret focused on tightening her grip, she failed to see the quiet changes around her. The slaves grew more silent and inward, speaking through looks and small movements instead of words. Moses's secret meetings in the woods became more frequent. Information traveled through unseen paths, carried from plantation to plantation by people sent on errands or hired out for labor. The resistance network was growing stronger, more organized, and the planned escape date was moved closer. In mid-June, on a night with no moon and heavy air that hinted at rain, Moses came to Evelyn with news. The escape would happen in 10 days, on a night when several things would work in their favor. There would be darkness, a gathering at a neighboring plantation to draw attention away, and reports of Confederate troop movements that suggested a temporary weakness in local patrols. Around 40 people would try to run together, heading north toward where Union forces were believed to be moving, into Arkansas. "You have to decide now," Moses told her. "Once we go, there's no going back. Anyone who stays will be questioned and suspected of knowing about the plan. It's not safe to wait." Evelyn felt the heavy weight of the choice settle on her chest. Escape meant risking everything. If they were caught, the punishment would be death or something even worse. But staying meant continuing to live under Margaret's cruelty, accepting years more of bondage, even if the Union eventually won the war. She thought of her mother, sold away long ago, and wondered if Ruth had ever faced the same choice, if she had ever had the chance to choose freedom over safety. As Evelyn considered the escape, another thought began to grow in her mind. It was dangerous, perhaps foolish, but it answered something deep inside her that had been stirred by years of Margaret's cruelty. She thought of the whipping tree, of the 40 lashes she had endured, of Sarah and Prudence and all the other women who had suffered under Margaret's harsh rule. She thought of Margaret's complete belief in her own right to cause pain without consequence. "I'll go with you," Evelyn said to Moses, "but there's something I must do first, something that needs to happen before I leave this place." Moses looked at her with both worry and understanding. "What are you planning, child?" Evelyn met his gaze calmly. "Justice," she said. "Just one small piece of justice before we run toward freedom." The days leading up to the escape were filled with a quiet tension only those involved could feel. To Margaret Whitmore and Jeremiah Cobb, the plantation seemed to be running smoothly, perhaps even better than usual. The slaves worked without complaint, kept their heads lowered, and carried out their tasks with steady precision. But beneath this surface, another reality was forming. Plans were being completed, supplies secretly gathered, routes memorized, and courage summoned for the dangerous journey ahead. Evelyn moved through her work in the big house with special care. She served Margaret's meals, cleaned her rooms, pressed her dresses, and maintained the flawless appearance of obedience that had been demanded of her for 14 years. Yet every action now carried purpose. Every moment near Margaret was used to gather final details that might prove useful. She noticed that Margaret kept a small pistol in the drawer beside her bed, a safeguard against rebellion she believed unlikely but possible. She observed that Margaret slept poorly, often waking at night to light a lamp and read or write letters. Without Charles, Margaret felt more alone than she wished to admit. She wrote long letters to family, attended church more often, and filled her days with efforts to assert control and fight the isolation that came with ruling a plantation during war. In her own way, she too was trapped by slavery. Though her prison was decorated with power and comfort, on the afternoon of June 24th, 3 days before the escape, Evelyn was cleaning Margaret's bedroom when she found something that would become essential to her plan. Inside a small jewelry box on the vanity lay a key she had never seen before. It was larger than the others, made of heavy iron. It took her a moment to understand what it opened: the chains, the punishment chains kept in a storage shed near the whipping tree, used when Margaret wanted someone restrained for long periods as added shame. Evelyn's hand shook slightly as she held the key. Until then, her plan had been vague, driven more by feeling than detail. She only knew she wanted to face Margaret, to make her understand what her cruelty had caused. Seeing the key brought sudden clarity. The idea was bold and frightening, likely to fail, but it spoke to something in Evelyn that could not be silenced. She slipped the key into her apron pocket with practiced ease and continued cleaning as if nothing were wrong. That evening, she made a wax impression of the key, using a method Moses had taught her long ago, a skill passed quietly among enslaved people. The next morning, while Margaret attended church, Evelyn gave the key and the wax mold to Moses. "Can you make a copy?" she asked, "and can you do it without anyone finding out?" Moses studied the impression carefully. "It'll take a day or two. There's a man on the Henderson plantation who works with metal and can do it quietly. But Evelyn, what are you planning? This kind of thing gets people killed." "I know," Evelyn replied, "but some things matter more than safety. Some things must happen, no matter the risk." Moses looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll have it made. But be careful, child. There's a thin line between courage and foolishness." 2 days later, on the evening of June 26th, the night before the escape, Moses brought the copied key to Evelyn. It wasn't perfect, but it would work. Along with it came Finn. Instructions. The group would meet at midnight in the woods beyond the eastern cotton fields, far enough from the quarters to avoid quick discovery. From there, they would move fast through planned stops, using safe places and hidden paths prepared in advance. The first 24 hours would be the most dangerous, and everything depended on speed, silence, and faith. Margaret Whitmore often spoke about the whipping tree, about all the cruelty and injustice that had gathered around it over the years, things she had seen, and things she herself had caused. Inside Evelyn, there was a part of her that frightened her because of how strong it felt. That part wanted more than escape. It wanted justice. It wanted the balance of power to change, even if only briefly, even if only in one small but meaningful way. In the weeks that followed, as Evelyn's back slowly healed and left behind a web of raised scars that would mark her body for the rest of her life, she was sent back to her duties inside the big house. Margaret treated her with fresh coldness, giving her extra work and watching her closely for any sign of disobedience. But Evelyn had learned how to shape her face into perfect obedience, even while her thoughts moved in entirely different directions. She began to watch the plantation more carefully than ever before. She noticed when Cobb made his rounds, when Charles Whitmore rode out to nearby plantations or went into town for business, and when Margaret was most often alone in the house. She memorized where keys were kept, learned the schedules of the other house slaves, and studied the daily patterns that ruled life on the Whitmore estate. She did not do this with a clear plan in mind. She simply gathered knowledge the way a squirrel gathers food for winter, understanding that knowledge itself could become power. Toward the end of May, something happened that changed everything. Charles Whitmore received news that his brother had been killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia. He would have to travel to settle family matters and handle his brother's estate, a journey that would keep him away from the plantation for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. Margaret would remain behind, in charge, with only Cobb and the house slaves for support and protection. The night before Charles left, Evelyn overheard a loud argument between him and Margaret. She was meant to be in the kitchen preparing their meal, but their raised voices carried clearly through the thin walls of the big house. Charles worried about leaving Margaret alone, with only an overseer to guard her, and suggested that she stay with relatives in Houston until he returned. Margaret refused without hesitation. She insisted that she was fully capable of running the plantation on her own and would not leave her home out of fear or inconvenience. She said the slaves were already broken and obedient. She claimed that the whipping she had given Evelyn in April had set the proper example, and that there had been no trouble since. She told Charles he worried too much and ordered him to go and handle his business, promising that the plantation would be exactly the same when he came back. Charles left the next morning and the plantation fell into a new rhythm under Margaret's sole control. If anything, she grew even harsher, quicker to criticize, quicker to punish. It was as if she needed to prove that she could rule as strongly as any man. She pushed the field slaves harder, lengthened their workdays, and cut their already small food rations over the smallest offenses. But while Margaret focused on tightening her grip, she failed to notice the quiet shift happening around her. The slaves grew more silent and inward, speaking through looks and small gestures instead of words. Moses's secret meetings in the woods became more frequent. Information traveled through hidden paths, passed from one plantation to another by people sent on errands or hired out for labor. The resistance network was growing, becoming more organized, and the planned escape was being moved closer. In the middle of June, on a night with no moon and air heavy with the promise of rain, Moses came to Evelyn with news. The escape would happen in 10 days, on a night when several things would work in their favor. There would be darkness, a gathering at a nearby plantation to distract attention, and information suggesting a temporary gap in Confederate patrols. Around 40 people would run together, moving fast toward the north, where Union forces were believed to be pushing into Arkansas. Moses told her she had to decide right away. Once they left, there would be no turning back. Anyone who stayed behind would be questioned and suspected. Waiting was too dangerous. Evelyn felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her. Escape meant risking everything. If they were caught, punishment could mean death or something worse. But staying meant enduring Margaret's cruelty, accepting a life of bondage that could stretch on for years, even if the Union won the war. She thought of her mother, sold away long ago, and wondered if Ruth had ever been given a chance to choose freedom over safety. As she considered the escape, another thought slowly formed in her mind. It was dangerous and perhaps foolish, but it spoke to something deep inside her that had been awakened by years of suffering. She thought of the whipping tree, of the 40 lashes she had taken, of Sarah and Prudence and the many other women who had endured Margaret's cruel authority. She thought of Margaret's certainty in her own right to hurt others without consequence. Evelyn told Moses she would go with them, but that there was something she needed to do first, something that had to happen before she left the plantation. Moses looked at her with worry and understanding mixed together and asked what she was planning. Evelyn met his gaze steadily and said it was justice, just one small act of justice before they ran toward freedom. The days leading up to the escape were filled with a quiet tension that only those involved could feel. To Margaret Whitmore and Jeremiah Cobb, everything seemed normal, even smoother than usual. The slaves worked without complaint, kept their heads lowered, and performed their tasks with dull precision. But beneath that surface, plans were being completed, supplies hidden, routes memorized, and courage gathered for the dangerous journey ahead. Evelyn moved through her duties in the big house with special care. She served Margaret's meals, cleaned her rooms, pressed her dresses, and maintained the flawless appearance of submission she had been forced to learn over 14 years. But now every action was done with sharp awareness. Every moment near Margaret was used to collect one last piece of information that might matter. She noticed that Margaret kept a small pistol in her nightstand drawer, a precaution against rebellion she believed unlikely but possible. She saw that Margaret slept poorly, often waking at night to light a lamp and read or write letters. Without Charles, Margaret felt more alone than she wished to admit. She filled her days with church visits, long letters, and strict oversight, trying to hold back the isolation that came with ruling a plantation alone during wartime. In her own way, she too was trapped by slavery, though her prison was lined with comfort and power over others. On the afternoon of June 24th, 3 days before the escape, Evelyn was cleaning Margaret's bedroom when she found something that would become vital to her plan. Inside a small jewelry box on the vanity was a key she had never seen before. It was larger and heavier than the others, made of dark iron. It took her only a moment to understand what it opened. The chains, the punishment chains kept in a storage building near the whipping tree, used when Margaret wanted someone restrained for long periods as added shame. Evelyn's hand shook slightly as she stared at the key. Until that moment, she had only known she wanted to face Margaret, to make her understand the pain she had caused. Seeing the key brought sudden clarity. The idea was bold and terrifying, almost certain to fail, but it answered something inside her that could no longer be ignored. She slipped the key into her apron pocket with practiced ease and went on cleaning as though nothing had happened. That evening, she made a wax impression of the key using a method Moses had taught her years earlier, knowledge passed quietly among enslaved people trying to survive. The next morning, while Margaret was at church, Evelyn gave Moses the key and the wax mold and asked if he could make a copy without being discovered. Moses studied it carefully and said it would take a day or two. He knew a man on the Henderson plantation who worked metal and could do it quietly. He warned her that this kind of plan could get people killed. Evelyn said she knew, but some things mattered more than safety. Some things had to be done no matter the risk. After a long look, Moses agreed, warning her that the line between courage and foolishness was very thin. 2 days later, on the evening of June 2006, the night before the escape, Moses brought Evelyn the copied key. It was not perfect, but it would work. He also brought the final instructions. The group would meet at midnight in the woods beyond the eastern cotton fields, far enough from the quarters to avoid quick discovery. From there, they would move fast through planned stops, using safe places and hidden paths already prepared. The first 24-hour hundreds you have ordered over the years, 10 lashes compared to the lifetimes of pain you have caused. Margaret could do nothing but cry, her body trembling with pain and shock. Evelyn lowered the whip to the dirt and stepped closer to the woman who had made her life miserable for so long. "I want you to remember this feeling," Evelyn said quietly, her voice firm and heavy. "I want you to remember it every single day for the rest of your life. Remember what it feels like to be powerless. Remember what it is like when someone else decides if you suffer or find relief, if you live or die. Remember that we are human beings, Margaret. Every one of us you whipped, sold, and broke down. We are human, with the same ability to feel pain that you have." She turned to walk away, but Margaret's voice stopped her. "You will never get away," Margaret said, her words thick with pain but still sharp with hate. "They will hunt you like animals. Cobb will lead the chase, and they will drag you back in chains. And when they do, I will make sure your death is slow and full of suffering, until you beg for the mercy of a simple whipping." Evelyn looked back at the broken woman chained to the post. "Maybe you are right," she said. "Maybe we will not make it. Maybe freedom is still far away, or maybe it will never come. But at least we will have tried. At least we chose to move toward hope instead of staying trapped in despair. What will you have, Margaret? When this war ends and your world falls apart, you will have memories of cruelty and the truth that you used your power only to cause pain." She walked out of the storage building without looking back, leaving Margaret chained and crying in the dark room. Outside, the afternoon sun burned bright, and the plantation felt strangely silent. Most of the field slaves were still working far away in the cotton rows, too distant to hear Margaret's screams. The house slaves, who understood what had happened, had been told to stay inside the big house and keep up the lie that everything was normal. Evelyn went to the slave quarters and gathered the few things she owned: one spare dress, a small cloth bag with a piece of bread and some dried meat, the letters Moses had taught her to read, and a small wooden carving her mother had made before being sold away. Everything she owned fit into one bundle she could carry with one hand. 14 years of her life reduced to a few objects inside a simple cloth sack. She changed from her house slave dress into the rough clothes of a field worker, better suited for travel. Then she went to find Moses, who waited near the edge of the quarters. "Is it done?" he asked. "It is done," Evelyn said. "Margaret is locked in the storage building. I left her alive, like I promised. Someone will find her. Cobb will start searching when she misses supper, and someone will hear her crying. By then, we should have several hours ahead of them." Moses nodded slowly. "The others are gathering. Everyone who is coming is ready. We need to leave within the hour if we want enough distance between us and anyone chasing us." They walked together toward the meeting place, moving through the land that had been both home and prison for so many years. Evelyn looked at everything with new eyes, knowing she would never return. The long rows of cotton, the big White House standing proud on its hill, the whipping tree with its wide branches. Soon, all of it would belong to her past. The group waiting in the woods beyond the eastern fields was larger than she expected. She counted 37 people, from teenagers to elders like Moses. They carried very little, traveling light to move fast. Some were families who chose to risk everything together rather than be torn apart. Couples held hands with quiet strength, and others stood alone, with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. There were field workers with scarred backs, house slaves who had lived close to their masters and knew how weak and human they really were, skilled workers who watched their labor make others rich while they stayed in chains, and women who had suffered violence and lost their children. Each person carried their own pain, their own story, and their own reason for choosing escape over slavery. Evelyn saw Clara and Ruth from the big house who had helped her with Margaret. She saw Samuel, a young field worker whose wife had been sold away to Mississippi. There was Dinah, an older woman and midwife whose knowledge of herbs would help them survive. There was Marcus, a blacksmith whose skills had protected him from the worst punishments, until he finally accepted that even favored slavery was still slavery. The escape was planned carefully over many weeks. They had guides, 2 men who had once tried to escape and been caught, but who remembered the routes and dangers. They had a rough map drawn from messages sent by free black people through secret networks. They had passwords to identify helpers and a plan to move quietly through hostile land. As night fell, Moses gathered everyone for a short moment of prayer and strength. He spoke in the coded words of scripture and song that enslaved people had used for generations. "We are crossing the Jordan. End tonight," he said. "The water is deep and the current is strong, but there is a promised land on the other side. Some may not make it, some may be pulled under. But those who reach the far shore will be free, and they will remember those who tried." Soft amens passed through the group. When the last light disappeared and darkness covered the plantation, they began to move. They traveled in small groups to avoid attention. One group slipped into the woods, then another, then another. Evelyn was among the last, with Moses, Clara, Ruth, and 3 others. As they moved through the dark woods, the sounds of the plantation faded behind her, the lowing cattle, the creak of the windmill, the barking dogs. Ahead waited the unknown, filled with danger and hope together. They traveled through the night, moving as fast as the land and the weakest among them allowed. They crossed streams by feeling for stones, pushed through thick brush that tore at skin and cloth, and followed the stars with the help of those who knew the way. Every sound felt louder in the dark: a snapping branch, a night bird, an animal moving nearby, each one possibly a threat, or just fear playing tricks on them. By dawn, they had gone about 15 miles from the Whitmore plantation. They were exhausted, feet bled, bodies ached, and they knew the chase would begin once Margaret was found. Still, they had survived the first night, and that mattered. They hid in a deep ravine to rest through the day, posting watches while others slept. Evelyn struggled to rest. Her thoughts returned to Margaret chained in the dark, to the whip in her hand, to the screams against the wooden walls. She wondered if she had done right, if her actions were worth the danger to everyone. Moses seemed to sense her thoughts. "You questioning what you did?" he asked quietly. "Not questioning," Evelyn said. "Just thinking about what it means." "It means what it means," Moses replied. "Maybe it does not change the whole world, but it changed something in you. And maybe in Margaret too. Whether that change grows or dies, only time will tell. But every slave who hears what you did will remember it. Everyone running with us will remember that someone stood up. That matters. Does it matter enough to risk everyone?" Evelyn asked. Moses paused. "You did not force anyone to come. Everyone chose for themselves. Some run because of the war. Some run because they cannot suffer one more day. And some run because they heard about a woman who stood up and lived. You gave them hope, Evelyn. Hope is dangerous, but it is also what keeps us human." They rested through the day, trading sleep and watch. As the sun rose, distant sounds drifted through the woods, maybe dogs, maybe nothing at all. Fear made every noise feel like danger. By mid-afternoon, the guides decided they could not stay. They would move early, trusting the thick woods to hide them better than waiting in one place. The group gathered their few belongings and prepared to move again our possessions, and then they kept moving north. The second day of travel proved harder than the first in almost every possible way. Deep exhaustion pressed down on the group like a heavy weight. Their bodies were not used to the constant strain of walking hour after hour without real rest. Feet that had been bleeding the night before were now swollen, sore, and showing signs of infection. Hunger gnawed at empty stomachs, as the small amount of food they had managed to carry was already running low, and hanging over everything was the unrelenting fear of pursuit. Every hour of travel brought them closer to freedom, yet at the same time carried them deeper into territory where being caught might mean death instead of a return to chains. They moved through thick pine forests and across open meadows, always choosing paths that offered the most cover. They waded through cold streams to confuse any dogs that might be following their scent. Roads and settlements were avoided at all costs. giving wide distance to any place where white people might see them and raise an alarm. The guides led them with remarkable skill, relying on landmarks and natural signs that meant nothing to untrained eyes but told them exactly where they were and which way to go. By the afternoon of the second day, they faced their first serious obstacle. They reached a river wider and deeper than expected, swollen by recent rains. The guides knew they would have to cross water somewhere, but they had hoped for a shallow crossing. Instead, they stood before a fast, dangerous current that looked deadly, especially for those who could not swim, and many in the group had never been allowed to learn. A quick meeting was held among the guides and the strongest people. They chose a place where the river narrowed slightly between two large rocks. Those who could swim would cross first, carrying ropes to secure on the far bank. Then they would form a human chain to help the non-swimmers across, gripping the ropes tightly to avoid being dragged away by the water. The crossing lasted nearly 2 hours and almost ended in disaster more than once. An elderly man named Joseph lost his footing and was pulled under, saved only because Marcus the blacksmith dove in and dragged him back to the surface. A young woman named Hannah was swept downstream and barely caught hold of a rock, clinging in terror until others could reach her. But in the end, almost unbelievably, all 37 people made it across, soaked, shaking with cold but alive. On the far side of the river, they allowed themselves a short rest. Evelyn sat with her back against a tree, wringing water from her dress and trying to warm hers. In the late afternoon sun, she looked at the faces around her, people who had risked everything, who had left the only homes they had ever known, who had chosen the frightening unknown of freedom over the familiar horror of slavery. She felt a strong pride in them and in herself, mixed with a heavy sense of responsibility for what they had begun. As night fell once more, they continued onward. The guides believed they had traveled nearly 40 miles from the Whitmore plantation, putting real distance between themselves and immediate capture. Still, they knew the alarm must have spread by now, that slave catchers could have been hired, that the full force of the slaveholding system would be moving against them. They were considered valuable property, and owners did not easily abandon what they believed belonged to them. On the third day of travel, they received their first clear sign that they were being hunted. One of the scouts, a young man named Isaiah, who had gone ahead to check the route, returned with urgent news. A group of mounted men, at least 8, were moving through the area behind them, clearly searching. Dogs were with them, and they were checking every possible hiding place, every stand of trees, every ravine. An immediate decision was made to split up. 37 people traveling together left too clear a trail, made too much noise, and were far too easy to spot. They divided into 5 smaller groups that would take slightly different routes, planning to reunite farther north if they could. That way, if one group was captured, the others might still make it through. Evelyn found herself in a group of 7, including Moses, Clara, Ruth, Samuel, Dinina the healer, and Marcus the blacksmith. They moved with even greater care. Knowing the hunters were close, they traveled mostly at night and hid during the day in caves, thick brush, or abandoned buildings. They ate very little, stretching their small supplies and adding berries, roots, and whatever small animals Marcus could catch. On the 5th day after leaving the plantation, they came closest to being caught. They were resting in a dense stand of trees when they heard dogs in the distance. The sound was unmistakable, hounds baying as they followed a trail, mixed with the shouts of men driving them forward. The group froze, each person holding their breath, silently praying the dogs would pass without finding them. The noise came closer, so close they could hear individual voices giving orders. Marcus quietly lifted a heavy stick, ready to fight if it came to that. Evelyn's hand went to the knife she had taken from the Whitmore kitchen, a small blade that would be nearly useless against armed men, but it gave her a tiny sense of not being completely helpless. Then, incredibly, the sounds began to fade. The dogs had picked up another scent or been turned in a different direction. The pursuers moved away, their voices slowly disappearing. The group stayed perfectly still for another hour, not daring to move or speak, before finally allowing themselves to breathe normally again. That night, as they continued on, Moses spoke words that captured what everyone felt. "We're ghosts now," he said, "moving through a world that wants to catch us and chain us, but we slip through their hands like smoke. Every day we stay free is a victory. Every mile we walk is a prayer answered." By the end of the first week, Evelyn's group had covered almost 80 miles. They were worn out, hungry, their clothes torn, their bodies covered in scratches and insect bites. Yet they were still free, still moving, still holding tightly to the hope that had pushed them to run. They had passed beyond the immediate reach of the Whitmore plantation, and were now in areas where their specific identities were not known, where they were simply nameless runaways instead of people tied to a single estate. They began to see signs of the war that had once felt far away. They passed places where Confederate troops had recently camped, saw old fire pits and discarded gear, and heard distant artillery from battles to the east. Farms stood abandoned or destroyed, crops rotting in fields because no one remained to harvest them, houses burned by one army or the other. The land itself told the story of a society tearing itself apart. Inside that chaos, they found chances to survive. They searched abandoned farmhouses for food and supplies. They met other escaped slaves who shared warnings and knowledge. They even received help from a few brave people, both black and white, willing to risk themselves to help those running toward freedom. On the 10th day after leaving the plantation, they crossed into Arkansas. The border meant little in practical terms, since slavery still existed and danger remained everywhere, but in their minds it felt important, as if they had stepped into a new chapter of their journey. They were now in an area where Union forces were known to operate, where freedom felt more real. It was there they finally received solid news about the Union lines. An elderly black man living alone in a small cabin far from any town told them Federal troops were camped about 60 miles to the northeast and were accepting escaped slaves. He drew a rough map in the dirt, showing landmarks and safer paths, and warned them about areas watched by Confederate patrols. "You're close now," he said. "Closer than you think. But these last miles may be the hardest. They know people are running this way. You'll need to be smart, careful, and lucky." With this knowledge, Evelyn's group pushed forward with renewed strength despite their exhaustion. 60 miles. It felt impossibly far, and yet painfully close. 60 miles between slavery and freedom, between the past and the future, between who they had been forced to be and who they might become. They traveled 3 more days, moving with extreme caution through land increasingly shaped by war. They spotted Confederate patrols and hid in ditches until they passed. They heard fighting in the distance and detoured around it. They crossed ground scarred and broken, where the old order was clearly falling apart, but danger still waited everywhere. On the 13th day after leaving the Whitmore plantation, as dawn spread over a line of hills, they saw something that made their hearts race. The flag of the United States flying above a distant camp, the Union lines at last. After nearly 2 weeks of fear, exhaustion, and determination, they had reached their goal. They approached carefully, still afraid it might be a trick or a dream. But as they drew closer, they saw Union soldiers in blue, watching them with curiosity, not anger. When they finally stepped into the camp and declared that they were escaped slaves seeking freedom, they were no longer running. They were welcomed not with chains, but with food, water, and the simple recognition of their humanity. A Union officer listened to their stories and wrote down their names, carefully recording every detail. When he reached Evelyn, she spoke her name clearly, and then added more. "I am Evelyn of Texas. I was enslaved on the Whitmore plantation for 14 years. Before I escaped, I gave my mistress 10 lashes at the same tree where she once had me whipped. I want that written down. I want it remembered." The officer stopped for a moment, his pen hovering above the page. Then he slowly nodded and wrote every word. "It will be remembered," he said quietly. "I will make sure of it." In the days that followed, Evelyn learned that 4 of the 5 groups that had broken away from the main escape had reached Union lines. 1 of the original 37 people who fled the Whitmore plantation and nearby estates made it to freedom. 6 were either captured again or died along the way, their names joining the long list of lives lost to a system built on human bondage. Moses survived, as did Clara, Ruth, Samuel, Dinah, and Marcus. All of them lived through the journey, though their bodies and minds carried deep scars from years of slavery and the dangerous flight north. They were sent to a contraband camp, the name given to escaped slaves who reached Union territory. There they worked for wages, received basic schooling, and began the slow work of building new lives. Evelyn's story spread quickly through the camp and beyond. The story of the enslaved woman who whipped her mistress before escaping became a strong symbol of resistance and justice. It was repeated in slave quarters across the region, passed along through quiet networks that connected enslaved people. Some versions grew larger with each telling. In certain stories, Evelyn nearly beat Margaret to death, or led the entire plantation in open rebellion. But the central truth stayed the same. A woman who had lived without power claimed it for a moment and survived to tell what she had done. Margaret Whitmore lived through the whipping, but she never fully healed from the mental damage of being tied and beaten by someone she believed was her property. Reports that reached Evelyn months later said Margaret became fearful and unstable, startled by small sounds, and refusing to be alone with any enslaved person. When Union forces finally moved into eastern Texas and slavery collapsed, Margaret fled to relatives in Georgia, abandoning the plantation that had once ruled her life. Charles Whitmore returned after settling his brother's matters and found everything in disorder, his wife deeply shaken and much of his labor force gone. He tried to keep the plantation running, but war, escapes, and eventual emancipation destroyed the system that supported it. The Whitmore plantation, once seen as strong and unchanging, was washed away by history like a house built on sand. Evelyns spent the rest of the Civil War in different contraband camps and later among communities of newly freed people. She learned not only to read, but also to write, and she became a teacher for children born into slavery who needed guidance in their new lives as free citizens. She never married and never had children of her own, but she became a mother figure to many young people who called her Miss Evelyn and sought her wisdom. After the war, during the brief years of Reconstruction when Black Americans gained limited rights and protection, Evelyn spoke publicly about her life in slavery. She shared her story in churches and community gatherings, not as a tale of revenge, but as proof of resistance and human dignity that no system could fully destroy. She always returned to the same message. What she did to Margaret Whitmore was not mainly about revenge, but about forcing someone who held total power to feel, even briefly, what powerlessness meant. The whipping was a turning of unjust power upside down, a symbol pointing toward the greater justice society still needed. True freedom, she said, required more than the end of slavery. It required a new society built on equality and mutual respect. Evelyn lived to the age of 67, dying in 1898, 35 years after escaping the Whitmore plantation. She spent those years helping her community, teaching, organizing, and preserving the memories of those who suffered under slavery and fought for freedom. She never forgot the names of those who died in bondage, who were sold away, who were whipped at the tree. She carried their stories with her so they would not disappear. The whipping tree on the Whitmore plantation still stood many years after slavery ended. It silently witnessed both the cruelty of the past and the resistance that overcame it. The tree became a local landmark, and people pointed it out to visitors, adding new details each time the story was told. Some said the tree was cursed and would never grow leaves again because of what it had seen. Others believed it was blessed, a symbol of strength and survival. Evelyn's story, like many from slavery and the Civil War, slowly faded from wider memory, buried beneath myths and a nation's unwillingness to face the truth about slavery. Yet it lived on in the spoken histories of Black communities, passed down through generations as proof that resistance was possible and that the human spirit could not be completely broken. In recent times, historians have begun uncovering stories like Evelyns, revealing the many acts of resistance that challenged slavery. These stories show a truth long hidden. Enslaved people were not passive victims, they were active participants in their own freedom. They fought back in ways both quiet and bold. The end of slavery was not only the result of political decisions, but the outcome of generations of struggle. Evelyn's act of whipping Margaret Whitmore at the same tree where she herself suffered stands as a strong symbol of that resistance. It was a dangerous act, possibly deadly, but also deeply necessary. Necessary for her dignity, and necessary as a message to others choosing between submission and freedom. This story reminds us that justice does not always come through courts or laws. Sometimes it comes from the oppressed themselves, from those who refuse to accept injustice and insist on their humanity. Evelyn's action was not approved by any legal system, yet it carried moral weight because it challenged